So let's talk just for a quick second about a veterinary clinic. So let's say you are a contractor and a vet clinic comes to you and says, we need to create a database for our business. We're doing really well and we've opened 3 new clinics in the Portland area. This is awesome. But we don't know anything. Like, we don't have a way of tracking our data. We don't know like what customers are going to what clinics. We don't know anything, right? So we need to have a way of like storing this data and being able to mine the data and come to some sort of business conclusions from it. Obviously, that would be ideal. So, so all of that being said, what do we do then? So we need to, oh, there's sweet. So we need to go and we need to ask some questions, right? So first we need to ask some questions of them to figure out what's going on with their business. So the first thing when you're doing a data model is you need to figure out what the entities are. So remember the sheet that I had given you guys or posted in detail? So first you need to figure out the entities. Now the entities are the big picture categories. So what are some entities that we think we might store in a data model? Now we had 2 to start with. So we had owner, and then we had pet, right? So that was our starting entities. We didn't know anything more than that for now, right? But so if you okay. So if you knew that, now what are some of the other things that we might want to ask that business? Reasons for visit. Okay, so that's a good one. So let's put visit. Okay. Awesome. Is there anything else that we might want to touch on to start with?
Maybe a way to contact them?
So absolutely. So a way to contact them is great. And I would say that that is an attribute. So that is absolutely an awesome thing. But that is one level deeper than we're talking about right now. So think about it this way as like we're talking about like general categories is where the entity is. And then contact them might be in the same kind of spirit as like name or some of those other pieces. And so that would be a descriptor of the entity itself. So that would be an attribute, but we will get there.
Would location be an attribute too?
No, I think location might be a very worthwhile thing to look at, especially given like the business parameter. It said that we have a couple of different locations, so that could be very worthwhile. What about what happens at the visit? Like a visit can probably have multiple procedures or a lot of different other things that go on, right? Like for all of us that have an animal, sometimes you just go for a normal checkup. Sometimes you have some other stuff going on. So maybe like the vet procedure that takes place might be worthwhile. So we're going to throw that over here. Okay. So when we're talking about entities, we're talking about those large categories, right? And then we go kind of to the next level downwards. So first we establish the entity, and then we're going to establish the relationships, and then we're going to go unique identifier, primary key, or I'm sorry, foreign key, and then we're going to go attributes. And you can kind of do, if you want, you can do attributes first. Sometimes that's easier. So what I would say is, for those of you that are learning, a lot of times I recommend doing attributes first, just because it's like you get to this place and then you're like, hell, what do I do next? And it's like the attributes are actually the easiest part, and sometimes there is an argument for doing the easiest part first, even though it doesn't really relate to some of those other things, but it can just be good to get your brain going. So we're going to do the relationships first, just because that's kind of more relevant for us to talk about in class. So one thing that I want to bring up first is, so how many people remember, quote, the transitive property? Comes up in like math and some other things. It's fine if you don't, because a lot of times people are like, what the hell are you talking about? So the transitive property is basically saying if A is related to B and B is related to C, then by connection A is related to C. So the transitive property just is basically like, if you say that like I know Samvel and Samvel knows Connor and then Connor knows Carter, then by connection I know Carter, is basically kind of what it's getting. Now that is super, super important in databases and data models, because what we're going to do is we're not going to have owner linked to pet, visit, and veterinary procedure, because that becomes really awkward. Like if you're trying to have all of the ways that they might interact and you have lines going to everything, it turns into hell in a handbasket very quickly. And so we were going to rely on this transitive property to basically get us an end around, so we don't have to deal with that kind of chaos and complexity. So for our relationships, the first thing that we're going to do is, I think it's pretty clear that owner and pet have a relationship, right? So we're going to say that there is a relationship between them. Okay. And then I think it's safe to say that there is a relationship between pet and visit. Is that safe to say? Does that make sense? We got some agreement there? And then it probably makes sense that we want to have a relationship between the veterinary procedure and the visit, right? Because we need to be able to know what happened, right? Like Connor brings in Fluffy and Muffy, and we need to know, like, okay, well, Fluffy got some vaccinations and Muffy got put to sleep because, you know, Fluffy's better than Muffy, and there can be only one. It's like the Highlander. So you need to be able to see that those are related. Okay. So that's a starting point. We've got like stage one of the relationships, right? So things are talking. And that's good. The next stage is being able to identify what the scope of that relationship is. And what I mean there is it a one-to-many? Is it a 0-1-to-many? Like, what type of relationship are we talking about? And this can often be, like, this step is often the step that is going to be most confusing as you're learning this. Just because it's like you kind of have to like say it out loud and think about it, and it's just, it took time for me to learn it too. But, so let's talk about the owner. So, what do we think the owner to pet relationship is? So an owner can have many pets, can have one pet, okay? If you remember last week, all jesting aside, but we were talking about if an owner can have no pets. And obviously that is literally a business definition of the word, right? Like, because you could say, no, an owner must have a pet. And like, I wouldn't argue with you. But the other piece is, let's say Connor's 2 pets pass away, but we still want to have him in our system and we care about him, and certainly we're going to start sending him push notifications about the lovely kittens that we have, so that maybe, you know, he wants Fluffy Jr. and Muffy Jr. or whatever. So we get to decide whether or not the owner can have 0 or 1. Certainly they can have many, right? But so that's something that we get to decide. And so because it has many, we're going to put the crow's feet. And then I think because we're going to be so supportive of Connor's idea last week, which I genuinely think was a good idea. So we're going to say an owner can have 0. And then, so one owner can have 0, 1, or many pets. So that's what that is telling us. Okay? So then I think the next piece that you want to look at is you want to say, okay, so a pet, obviously let's talk about visits, right? So one pet can have many visits. I mean, hopefully it's not sick, but it could have many visits, right? It could have 1 visit. Could a pet have 0 visits? Right? I mean, that's a very fair point. Like, so you could say wouldn't be in the system, right? You could also say, like, I tend to agree with you, by the way, so I'm not like I'm not like disagreeing, but you could say, like, maybe if Connor had gotten new pets and he informed us, but it seems silly that that would happen. So probably they have to have at least 1 visit for us to be tracking them. So I think you're 100% correct. So we're going to say 1, and then we're going to say 1 many. So that determines the scope of that interaction. Okay. So here is the tough one. Okay. So the visit, okay, so every visit can have, so like 1 visit can have 0 procedures? I mean, like, it depends on how you classify a procedure, right? But let's say a procedure is service provided, right? Like, so even just like checking up, getting the vitals or whatever else. So probably they couldn't have nothing happen, right? So it probably has to be at least 1. But they could have many, right? They could have like super health problems or whatever else, like who knows, right? So again, we have this, okay? So now we've gone and established all of the like left to right relationships. I know that sounds weird, but now you kind of need to go the reverse direction to also see if the relationships are consistent the other direction. And you'll see why as we do this. So a veterinary procedure, so one veterinary procedure, can it be affiliated with multiple visits? Right? Like theoretically, Connor could bring in one of his cats and they get their vitals taken and everything else, and they get, a certain vaccine. And that procedure could happen with Samvel's cat, my cat, multiple of his cats, since he has a forest of cats, like whatever. So the reality is the veterinary procedure could be affiliated with numerous visits. And by identifying that, we create this very real life problem. Because now we have basically shown that we have a many-to-many relationship. So you could have many visits that have many procedures, and it's really hard to unpack like what is going on. This basically turns into something that makes databases like explode. Not literally, but stop working. So when you have a many-to-many relationship, there is a specific way that we have to resolve it. And there's a specific thing that we have to do to make it work. And what we do is we create something called an associative entity, which is basically we create an entity that is a placeholder in between them. And so what we do is we create this associative entity here. And I'm just going to call it visit procedure. Normally when you have an associative entity, like the way you name it is just like combining the two terms from the entities that are related. It's just kind of dumping stuff together. So there isn't really a method to the madness. And what you do is you create two one-to-many relationships that are in between. That's better. Sorry, guys. So when you have a many-to-many relationship between visit and vet procedure, you have to create an associative entity that effectively is an intermediate so the function of the database doesn't collapse. And you basically resolve the many-to-many relationship by just creating two one-to-many relationships. So you have a one-to-many relationship here that represents this guy, and then you have a one-to-many relationship here that represents that guy. And that is something that is probably one of the most uncomfortable parts of the data modeling thing. And I would say the best takeaway is for you to know that a many-to-many relationship cannot happen. And if it does happen, you have to have an associative entity as an in-between to kind of facilitate the structure of what needs to happen. So for what we're trying to do, this is kind of sufficient for setting up the relationships, right? So it's like, okay, so we have our entities, we have our large-scale entities, and we have the relationship set up, so now all of our tables can talk. Now remember, the relationships allow the tables to communicate to each other, which is the point of the database. If you don't have relationships set up, then your owner table is not connected to the veterinary procedure, so you don't have the ability as a business owner to say, Connor, what veterinary procedures has Connor had for his animals, right? Which is something that you might want to know, right? Like, that's probably relevant if he needs to know if all of his animals are up to date on their vaccinations, right? Or God knows what, right? But you can imagine a variety of questions that you might ask where you need to have the ability to take the data from here and the data from here and be able to know what's going on. And the relationships allow those tables to talk. So let's go and start talking about the unique identifiers or the primary keys. So let's talk about us as citizens or people in the United States. So is a unique identifier for me my name? I mean, it's literally not. There's literally a famous Tim Finn from New Zealand. He's a jerk because he's like a rock star or something, and he has like the website timfin.com. I was really salty about it back in the day. It's a longer story than we have time for, but nonetheless, also my dad's name is Tim Finn. So there's plenty out there. So that's clearly not unique. Even if you use first name and last name, right? Clearly that's not unique. So you could probably go and say like first name, last name, and like cell phone number maybe. But like imagine back in the day when like there was landlines and like I lived at home. Clearly Tim Finn plus phone number could have been my dad or myself, and that's not unique, right? So again, remember on its core principles, when we say unique identifier, it must be unique. It must be truly only one. Probably say like maybe social security number. Like that's one that kind of comes to mind, right? Or like student ID as like a student at Portland State, whatever your, is it 9? It's 10 digits, I think? Anyways, whatever. But your student ID number, whatever that is. But the reality is that I think certain social security numbers are reused. So I don't know that there is like my social security number is currently in use right now with something else, like with someone else. But I do believe that there is like a recycling of it in some way. And so as a result of that, there are some potential databases where my social security number could have multiple results that return over the course of time. So social security number is kind of okay, but it's not flawless. Also think about like driver's license number. Like that's great, but not everyone has a license. So, think about some of the things that we interact with. And so again, going back to me being super lazy and trying to keep things easy, I love having my unique identifiers just be whatever the entity name is plus ID. It's great. So I would say owner ID. Do a little underscore. Say pet ID. Say visit ID. We're going to ignore the bottom guy for right now, and you'll see why in just a second. And so we'll say vet procedure ID. Now, there's two different ways to denote a primary key. It's kind of like terminology related. So I'm going to show you both. So one is to do PK in parentheses next to it. The other is to underline it. I tend to prefer PK. I, for the life of me, don't know why. I just do. So I'll probably use that mostly when I'm interacting with you guys. Understand both are technically correct, so I'm not going to like, if you guys are underlining stuff, so be it. And some people will be rather like, this is the only way. It is fine. So we'll do PK here. Do PK here. PK here. Okay. So one of the things that's very interesting about the associative entities is basically sometimes the associative entities are also called parent-child relationships. And what that means in this case is the associative entity is the child of these two parents. And that actually has some great utility as you think about stuff for one reason. The associative entity takes on the properties of both of the parents, right? So it's a child, and so it takes on the characteristics of the parents. So it's going to get visit ID and that procedure ID. And they kind of import. And we'll touch on a little bit more of what's going on there in just a second, but I just wanted to show that kind of transferal. Now, we can track a variety of things. Information might be something that we would care about for owners, right? Address probably, right? For pets, maybe breed, maybe weight, age, whether it likes to bite. I mean, that's actually a real thing. Like, my friend is a vet, and she's just like, I hate big dogs or big animals because if they're, like, docile, it's great. But if they're not, like, it can be really, really challenging to subdue them, and you never know if they're going to be, like, aggressive or not. So that would be absolutely relevant to track, like, in there, right? So you can kind of conceive a variety of attributes that we would do. And those, you got to remember, attributes are descriptors that we care about for our business function. That's the last step. And so before we do there, we're going to talk about primary key and foreign key. So we've established our primary keys, and that's great. But our foreign keys need to exist so that that way we can talk back along our connection. So we have this connection here. We have this relationship between owner and pet. And so we have a primary key that uniquely identifies the entry in this table, and that's great. And we have a primary key here that uniquely identifies the pet that corresponds to that entry. But the way that we affiliate that pet with that owner is through the foreign key. That's why that's so important. So anytime you have a one-to-many relationship, the primary key from the one side is pulled over here and becomes the foreign key. So what you're going to have is you're going to have owner ID, and you're going to have FK, and it will not be underlined. So this foreign key talks to this primary key and allows you to affiliate all of this data with what's going on here. So it is a very, very important. I would say for you guys to really take away for right now, you want to be able to understand the idea of what entities are. You want to be able to understand how you establish the relationships between entities. And you want to understand that primary keys or unique identifiers must exist in every table. And foreign keys are going to allow the relationships that we've already said need to happen. Foreign keys are going to allow it to happen. They're going to facilitate that. So if we were looking at this, so we have pet to visit. So we have a primary key here. So we're going to have a foreign key come in. Right there. And that is going to allow these to talk. Now, we don't have to worry about this guy having a foreign key because he's only on the one side, right? We don't have to worry about this guy having a foreign key because he's only on the one side. Now, where it gets a little bit confusing, and so I'm going to do this, and this is kind of where we'll end for the day. But so if you remember, we pulled visit ID from this table, and we pulled veterinary procedure ID from this table. And so this is a primary key, and this is going to be a foreign key, right? Because we have a one-to-a-many relationship. And likewise, this is a primary key. Come down here, and this is going to be a foreign key. Okay. Now, the kind of sneaky thing that often happens in the child or in the associative entity is rather than having visit procedure ID as the primary key, you make these together the primary key. And so them together is called a composite key, and that is often what takes place with that. So that is something that is specific to an associative entity and how that tends to work out. But so I would say before we wrap, because we'll obviously talk about this in more detail on Wednesday. So what I would like you guys to do is to think about what attributes you think should go into all of these. So on Wednesday, what we'll do is we'll fill out this table to some degree with what the attributes are, and maybe we'll talk about how the data model would work and some of those other things and how that would interface. Make sure you have your guys' questions about all of these terms, because I guarantee not everyone is comfortable with this at this time. And then we'll talk in more detail then. All right, awesome. Thank you, everyone.